Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly review of international affairs. In international relations, it is not always that events take place suddenly, dramatically. There are crises that have to be managed. There are times when there seems to be a lull. Diplomatic activity is invisible, low-key, and things seem to be moving at a much slower pace than we expect them to be. But nonetheless, they are no less important. They also change power equations significantly. They also have the potential of suddenly evolving into a crisis or impinging on our international interest. The past month has been something like this, and lots of activity, lots of interactions have followed this route. There has been a very interesting visit of the Indonesian president to China, a very high-level meeting, the first foreign guest of this level to be received by Xi Jinping since the Winter Olympics, when, of course, Putin and Imran Khan and Bolsonaro had visited him. But this is the first time that this kind of a significant state visit is taking place. And Indonesia is a very, very important country. It is the largest population of the Muslims in the world. It is the fifth largest populated nation in the world, 17,500 islands, and so on. Very rich in natural resources. Leader of the ASEAN group, uncrowned leader of the ASEAN group, so to speak. So what was behind this? This is something which we'll have to examine. At the same time, there was another summit meeting organized in Bangladesh. Is called the Group of D8, Developing 8 Nations. And you look at these nations, then you find out they are not representative of all the developing nations. They fit into a particular category of developing nations which have predominantly large Muslim populations or are Muslim states. And the origins of this grouping are can be traced back to 1997 in Istanbul, and Turkey seems to be the motivating force behind this. So when this was taking place, Bangladesh also put in a request to IMF to receive a bailout of about US dollars 4.5 billion, so which should prick ears, because people should realize that is Bangladesh following the same way as Sri Lanka, where a foreign exchange crisis is brewing. And while all this was happening, we could see some very interesting wooing of Africa. The President Macron visited lots of states in Africa. Then the Foreign Minister of Russia, Lavrov, visited another set of countries. At times, the American envoy for Africa, Hammer, had scheduled visits in Africa. And at times, these paths crisscrossed, creating some tensions, some speculations. So while all this was going on, it seemed that the excitement in Sri Lanka was dying down, but it appeared that people who had suddenly captured power, constitutionally of course, were trying to set the hands of the clock back and go back to a status quo ante. We shall have to examine all that and a little more. And then while we were discussing these political developments, these agreements, possibilities of a temporary truce between Russia and Ukraine to facilitate the trade export, suddenly Russia started attacking the ports in Odisha, and it seemed that they were reneging on the agreement they had reached. World had just gotten back to more or less normal after COVID, when another pandemic was threatening on the horizon, the monkeypox. And once again, WHO, its utility or its dysfunctionality, its structural infirmities were again sharply in focus. We shall be discussing all this and share our views with you this time. To begin with, the Indonesian president's visit to China. The relationship between Indonesia and China has always in the recent years been a close and a cordial one. Indonesia has a scale of trade with China which is mind-boggling, to say the least. Its scale is 124.7 billion US dollars in a year, and there is a trade imbalance. But interestingly, in this case, the imbalance of trade is in Indonesia's favor. So, for both Indonesia, China is an important trading partner, and for China, Indonesia is an important trading partner. But it is not only that trade brings these two countries together. Look at the geopolitical map. Indonesia is an collection of 17,500 islands, big and small, spanning the sea, the Indian Ocean to Pacific Rim almost, from Andamans to Papua and New Guinea. It overarches like an umbrella over Australia. It is the claimant of the status of the natural, regionally dominant power in the ASEAN. It is very, very resource rich. And if you look towards the north of the archipelago, you have the island of Borneo, one of the largest islands in the world, house to rainforests, which are second only to the rainforests in Brazil and Argentina. So Indonesia has an impact on international relations and politics, which people normally don't give significance to. It is the largest nation with the Muslim population in the world. It is the fifth largest nation in terms of population otherwise. And it is an oil-producing country. It is a rich historical tradition, and it has great technological competence. Now, if you keep all this in mind, it is understandable that why China is interested in placating the Indonesian president. What is more interesting is that the Indonesian president has also been trying to cultivate China indirectly. When the war broke out in Ukraine, Widodo, the Indonesian president, first visited Ukraine, met Zelensky, then went to Moscow, met Putin. Then this time also, he has told Xi that Indonesia would be very happy to act as a bridge to communicate between two nations, and if possible, bring them to a negotiating table, bring them to a truce or some kind of a reconciliation. This may or may not happen, but Indonesia is positioning itself to a role which goes beyond the ASEAN region and on the international arena. The other interesting part is that China has invested in the One Belt, One Road massive ambitious scheme in Indonesia also. China has talked on two-pronged strategy for this. There is the historic Silk Road, which runs through Central Asia to Turkey, beyond to Europe. The other is the maritime Silk Route, more appropriate to be the spice route, which goes back to the expeditions of Admiral Cheng He in the 13th, 14th century. And Chinese claim that their historic claim to this vast body of water in South China Sea and in Indian Ocean dates back to those historical claims there, which neither Indonesia nor Indians accept. But the point is that the contexts are there earlier also. Chinese have invested in railway between Jakarta and Bandung, a 147-kilometer thing, which is supposed to be a major project there. But unfortunately, this project has had overtime lags, overruns, cost overruns, and there have been environmental concerns that this rail line would do damage to a fragile ecosystem in the central Java area. The Chinese, to make Indonesians happy, despite their trade balance, have given an order of 1 million tons of palm oil to be imported. Now, this is interesting because some stress had taken place between India and Indonesian relations, which are normally very friendly and cordial, when Indonesia stopped the export of palm oils, because it was said at that stage that Indonesia was trying to have palm oil diverted to biofuel production, and this would leave very little for edible productions elsewhere. And India is the largest purchaser of palm oil in the world, both from Indonesia and from Malaysia. So there was this issue there. But this seems to have been sorted out as far as China is concerned, at least for the time being. There is another interesting thing here, that Indonesia is going to be the next chair of the G20, and after Indonesia, the chair would pass on to Japan and South Korea. So for China, from Chinese point of view, this is the most opportune time to cultivate Indonesia. So China and Indonesia would be on the same page, and China would not have to cope with, if not hostility, the resistance, the pushback of Japan and South Korea. And also, this relationship assumes importance in the context of American machinations in this area. First, they formed the Quads, then they formed the AUKUS. And in this case, the relationship, if China redefines its relationship with Indonesia, it would go to a very large extent to countervailing the American influence in this area, whether it is Quads or whether it is AUKUS. The Chinese have also assured Indonesians that their partnership would be helping others. They would cooperate in vaccine diplomacy, etc. Now, come to think of it, you see these are the issues which Americans have mandated for India to do: environmental concerns, technical exchanges, vaccine diplomacy, and China seems to be carving out the same role for itself, collaborating with Indonesia. Now, there is nothing surprising about this. But before we proceed any further, there is another thing. The Indonesians are also designated to be the next chair of ASEAN. Now, this again is important because the present chair of ASEAN is somebody who is very pliable for the Chinese. It is the Cambodians. But the Cambodians have acted in a manner which seems to have upset the inner balance of the ASEAN members, trying to be partisan in the conflict in Myanmar. It has raised some eyebrows in other countries in ASEAN which don't look favorably at the Myanmar military junta. So the Chinese would be cutting their losses if Cambodia ceases to be the chair of ASEAN and Indonesia is there. It may not be as pliable as Cambodia, but it would not be an adversarial relationship as well. So we have this in mind. All these reasons militate in favor of China. But it is time also to have a quick look about India-Indonesia relations, India-ASEAN relations, and how this visit is going to impinge on us. First of all, let's not forget that India and Indonesia have centuries-old cultural and commercial ties. When you take the language in Indonesia, you take their folk arts, classical arts, myths, legends, concept of kingship, everything seems to be, if not derived, deeply influenced by these concepts in India. The world's largest Buddhist stupa, Borobudur, is in Java. The cult of Shiva Buddhism is a blending of Shaivite philosophical ideas and the Buddhistic concepts into one form. You have their epics Ramayana and Mahabharata, which are depicted in the shadow plays of Wayang Kulit in Indonesia. The names are there: Megawati Sukarno, you have Gajamada, you have Shailendra, you have Srivijaya, the names of old kingdoms, and you see that dating back to the Chola period and even earlier, before the birth of the Christ, we have this interaction between this archipelago and India. But then what has gone wrong? After independence, even before independence, it was an Indian, Biju Patnaik, who flew Hatta to run through the blockade of the Dutch and land him there. He is historically and gratefully remembered there. Throughout the period of non-aligned movement, Nehru and Sukarno were supposed to be the joint founding fathers of the movement. But what went wrong was that right after the Bandung Conference, where Chinese were invited courtesy India, the Chinese tried to drive a wedge between India and Indonesia and tried to pamper Sukarno's ego, set him up against Nehru and said he treats you like a younger brother, he tries to patronize you. And they succeeded in drawing apart Sukarno and Indonesia from India. So by the time the Belgrade Conference took place, Indonesia led the new emerging forces inspired by China, put priority on neocolonialism, and India was stuck with disarmament, nuclear disarmament, concept of peace. India was branded as a reformist nation and a gathering. Then came China's war with India, in which the axis was forged between, this is called the Beijing-Jakarta-Pindi axis, and since that day, Indonesia and China and Pakistan have been arrayed for most part on the same side. There was a short lull when there was an anti-Chinese movement in Indonesia. Hundreds of thousands of people of Chinese origin in Indonesia were killed. The Communist Party of Indonesia was eliminated. And the Americans seemed to be the most powerful advisors in Indonesia. And it was said that the Cornell Mafia was dictating what was to be the economic policy in Indonesia. But this period has ended long time back. At the height of the Cold War, at the height of the war in Indochina, ASEAN had grown out of ASA, the Association of Southeast Asian States, to ASEAN, which was conceived as an anti-communist bulwark. But by now, we have come the full circle. What we see that Indonesia is not as hostile to India as once it was, and renamed Indian Ocean as Indonesian Ocean. But there has been no close cordiality between India and Indonesia, despite the cultural affinities. I think this is something which India must keep in mind, because what seems to be happening in the aftermath is likely to happen in the aftermath of the visit of Widodo to China, and the cordiality shown by Xi Jinping and Widodo together, that they would be working together for keeping external influences out and peaceful. This seems to be more or less a fait accompli, which Chinese have done in Indonesia to redress the imbalance which Quads and AUKUS, with Indian participation in Quads, seems to be taking place in Southeast Asia. The Chinese have territorial disputes with Philippines and with Vietnam in this region, but so far no such dispute has surfaced in Kalimantan Uttara, that is northern Borneo, and this is where I think India should keep a steady eye and try to review developments as they take place. We should not be caught in a back foot here again. Two interesting news items from Bangladesh have attracted our attention in the past few days. First was the convention of D8 summit in Dhaka. D8 is a very interesting grouping of developing nations. If you look at them hard and close, you would find out that they are not really representative of all the developing nations. It is supposed to be a transcontinental get-together of these nations, but all the nations are either with large Muslim populations or polities, Islamic polities. So this is a gathering of Islamic polities or Muslim majority population nations who claim to be developing nations. Interestingly, who are there? The original idea came from Turkey in 1997. In Istanbul, it was formed. And there's a rotating chair as usual in such occasions. Turkey is there, Iran is there, Pakistan is there, Nigeria is there, Indonesia is there, Malaysia is there, Iran is there. Now, and Bangladesh, of course, is there. Now, if you see, it is a highly selective grouping which seems to suit Turkey at one end, who always in recent days, it came before, it was founded before Erdogan, but Erdogan has found uses for this as well. So it allows Turkey, semi-Western, modern, more tolerant, more moderate Islamic version, but with ambitions of international influence, using this forum. It also works at, shall we say, cross purposes from other regional organizations. SARC may have been a dead horse long time back, but there have been other regional organizations which BIMSTEC is there, ASEAN is there, and all these seems to be working at cross purposes if there are these small meetings take place. Again, the news item is of importance because Bangladesh was registering one of the fastest economic growths in recent days, and it had very, very enviable social development indicators despite COVID. So why is suddenly Bangladesh willing to identify itself as a developing nation? But then again, if you look at the other developing nations, this grouping is not actually the rock bottom of the developing nations. It is the almost middle income countries, whether it is Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria, coming together with Burma, which is there, which is interesting. Then again, the other news item which had drawn our attention to Bangladesh was Bangladesh had put in a request with International Monetary Fund to give it a bailout package of US dollars $4.5 billion. Now, this raised eyebrows. Is Bangladesh following the same route as Sri Lanka? It also has hardly 7.5 billion US dollars in its foreign exchange reserve. Its remittances have been hit hard. The Bangladeshis working abroad used to send foreign exchange to their mother country, and they have fallen by 5%. The export earnings of Bangladesh have fallen because it was a major garment exporter. It also has been unfortunately hit by natural calamities. The floods which recently hit Bangladesh are estimated have caused a damage of to property of US $9 billion. So all these combined have impacted very adversely on Bangladesh's economy. So Bangladesh is trying to get in time the bailout from IMF so it doesn't meet the fate of Sri Lanka. There is no hubris. Now, of course, Sheikh Hasina's government has been criticized by the opposition party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, by saying that part of the thing is mismanagement of economics by Sheikh Hasina's government and for adopting very prestigious, very ambitious, highly visible projects like the long bridges, etc. Some of them, of course, India has collaborated. Some Bangladesh has done on its own. Again, Bangladesh cannot deny, whoever is the government in Bangladesh, cannot deny that the proximity with China and the temptation to take aid from China for developmental projects has also lent them, if not in a debt trap, very close to it. So these two things are interesting about Bangladesh at the moment. In recent past, the Indians and Bangladeshis the governments have had no cause for complaint. Even if there were instigated anti-India protests during Indian Prime Minister's visit to Dhaka, the government dealt with them strictly and the violence was controlled immediately. There have been provocative statements made by some irresponsible Indian leaders. Bangladesh has reacted to it with great maturity. That's one part. But India cannot remain indifferent to the threat, the looming threat of economic despair and economic dislocation in Bangladesh, because keeping in mind the thousands of kilometers long porous border, the internal displacement or political instability is bound to have an impact on India. When we talk of Bangladesh's economic problems, the world must also take notice of that Bangladesh has been coping with the burden of millions of Rohingya refugees on its own. So its economy has been coping with several threats: environmental disasters, influx of refugees, reduction in remittances by Bangladeshis abroad, and probably the Bangladeshi leaders have not stood on hubris and applied. One hopes that the IMF takes notice of this. IMF has already taken notice of Pakistan's problems with great alacrity. Pakistan wanted a $6.5 billion bailout immediately, partly to repay its or reschedule its loans with Saudi Arabia, etc. Bangladesh hopefully will get the same urgency of treatment as IMF has given to Pakistan. But let's not forget that Pakistan is always looked after by United States, and the influence of countries like United States on international financial institutions like IMF is very, very strong. So maybe the parity is not always there, but the problem remains. And India again has to worry, because what is happening in Bangladesh is reminiscent of what happened in Sri Lanka. And right now there are constitutional crises in Nepal, but Nepal also has had to adopt measures, which is to restrain the outflow of foreign exchange. Landlocked country, totally dependent on food grains and fuel on imports, limited foreign exchange, tourism badly hit after COVID, governmental mismanagement, charges of corruption. So Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka fall in not quite in the same category, but as far as India is concerned, they are nations adjacent to us, which have a relationship with China, economic, at times some strategic influence also, and also deep-rooted cultural ties, which can be not always the basis of understanding. You may call some misunderstanding also, because sovereign nations have a very sensitive, thin skin. An interesting development in recent days has been the wooing of Africa by many major countries. It began with President Macron of France, who mounted a hectic tour of many countries in Africa. He went to Cameroon, assured Cameroon that France was not trying to get back through a back door as a colonial power. He returned to them the looted artifacts, artworks from Africa, which French colonialists had taken. He also made amends for abusing freedom fighters during the French colonial rule in Africa. But there was a lurking suspicion that he was doing this not entirely to refurbish his image after the defeat in the parliamentary elections. He was trying to project France as a power to reckon with on the international arena. When he was re-elected, he had tried to say that the European Union should have an independent strategic policy, it should have an independent foreign policy. He was the natural claimant for the leadership and articulating of that foreign policy. But his sudden debacle in the parliamentary election took some wind out of his sails. Before that, he had even tried to reconcile the conflict in Lebanon. But people have been watching France with some suspicion. They think that France's interest in these countries, take for instance Cameroon. Now, Cameroon is being led by a leader who's 89 years old. When Macron was 5 years old, this man had come to power and he has ruled there uninterrupted. So people suspect that Macron is only trying to support leaders, however unpopular, however undemocratic, however violating of human rights they are, as long as French national interest or his own image is served well. Now, this gentleman has nominated his son to succeed him after one day he passes away from the stage, and the ill will of the people would stick to Macron, who's been supporting this leader. It has happened, the same kind of pattern is followed in Guinea-Bissau, in Burkina Faso, in Gabon. Now, all the Francophone states, the French Africa as it was called, and also the Sahel region, and the France's presence either through French Foreign Legion or through its participation in United Nations peacekeeping forces. Although Macron has repeatedly said under pressure from his electors in France that he will withdraw if people don't want him. But when he withdraws, then again he is blamed for letting the insurgents, letting the extremist factions of Islamic terrorists, ISIL splinter groups, taking over territory. This has happened in Mali, this has happened in Chad. So wherever he visits, unfortunately, there is no way he can strike a balance, because Africa is in a constant state of turmoil. There are despots ruling, there are multinational corporations operating, there are more than dozens of insurgents groups, there are Islamic terrorists, and whenever a leader of the stature of Macron goes there, it is easy to say that his visit alone lends support to a tyrant or justifies the state of instability which is going on. He also is providing a cover for the multinational corporations of his own country or of his allies in Europe. So this much was about Macron. But at the same time, the more interesting visits were by the Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov. Mr. Lavrov also took a hectic tour from Egypt to Ethiopia, touching down some other countries, Uganda and so on. Now, he is very carefully preparing ground for Putin's possible visit to Africa. There has been a presence, an undeclared, indirect covert presence of Russia by armies, mercenary armies, and fighting with different factions and supporting them. But the Russians have a natural affinity, or shall we say the other way around, most African nations hark back to the days of their friendship when they had socialist governments. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was there. Many African leaders had studied in Moscow or other Russian universities. So people still remember that during the Cold War, when Congo was split, Patrice Lumumba was commemorated with a university named after him in Russia. These days are passé. One can't say that Putin is inheritor of the legacy of the USSR. But Putin is very much conscious of the fact that these countries which had residual affinity with their friendship with the Soviet Union should not fall into the camp of the Americans. So Putin, at the moment, is trying to whittle down the criticism that his invasion in Ukraine has resulted in a food and energy crisis for most nations in Africa who are starving and who are facing a humanitarian crisis. The effort of Lavrov throughout his diplomatic mission has been to say that it is not the Russian invasion of Ukraine which has created the crisis, it is the Western sanctions against Russians which have stopped Russia from either exporting gas or food grains. Now, this is something which we'll see who persuades the Africans well. There is a groundswell in Africa, even in the despots, to say that our concept of democracy is very different from the Western concept of democracy. Our concept of human rights is not exactly coincidental with the Western concept of human rights. And when an African leader is criticized for either violation of human rights or not being democratic enough, they say that, look, who's talking? They point fingers at America, they point fingers at racism, they point fingers at history of colonialism, and they find Russia a more natural ally. Lavrov went to Ethiopia, and at that time it coincided with the visit of the American Special Envoy for Africa, Hammer, who was there at the same time, and Lavrov wrote a letter to the leaders of African Union offering collaboration and cooperation. This is exactly what Hammer was supposed to be doing, not at the African Union level, but there. So this gathering of the some African nation leaders, Lavrov, Hammer in Ethiopia, created a rather amusing situation where they were trying to jockey in for power at the same time. Now, Ethiopia itself has been troubled with the conflict, the civil war-like conflict within. Eritrea is in a trouble spot. Somalia is in a horrible mess. So this seems to be a situation where Africa is going to be a stage where another skirmishing round of major powers might start immediately. People are waiting for decisive elections in 2024, which bring out either a president who's more actively interested in Africa or otherwise. Nobody wants to leave the African continent free for the Russians to operate, but everything seems to be in a flux, and no country in Africa seems to be in a position to assert its sovereign rights or to follow its own national interests on its own. Now, Indians do not have capability of influencing developments in this vast continent, but India has very vital interests in the eastern coast of Africa, in the northern Maghreb part of Africa, even in the northwestern tip of Africa, when Nigeria and other oil-producing countries are there. But Ghana again has been facing terrible economic mess, and again a basket case looking for IMF support. Now, Indians have had relationship at various levels with African countries, at the level of non-line movement, at the level of Commonwealth relationships and mutuality of interest, and India's fight against apartheid and racism. Now, all this again is historical memories. How much can we capitalize on them, and how much can we ensure that our interests are not trampled upon by the big powers following their own interests, is something which we'll have to be careful about. We have been witnessing some very curious developments in Sri Lanka. To begin with, everybody heaved a sigh of relief when the government formation took place without many hiccups. Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in as the president. He appointed a prime minister of his choice. A cabinet was formed. He kept saying that he would like to have an all-party cabinet, but majority of the people who supported him, he actually became the president with the support of the MPs of Rajapaksa's party. So many people expressed the apprehension that it might be the backdoor entry of the Rajapaksa family again. He would remain a puppet or a protege. He never has been a protege of Rajapaksa's. They defeated him for a presidential election once. But when the master opportunist got the presidency, if he carefully plays his cards, he might remain in power till the next elections, where the Rajapaksa family might be hit by the unpopularity in the electoral battles, and he might get electoral support, which makes him independent of the Rajapaksa family. But that is still far away in future. He has to pull his nation out of the economic morass in which it has fallen. So we are still waiting and watching whether the IMF will give in time the bailout which he is requesting. Will he be in a position to implement the policies which IMF wants him to follow, or it would be the last straw on the back of the camel, and once again the popular anger will explode in a manner which will be very difficult to control. Right now, he imposed emergency. He ordered the military to take control, restore law and order. Tear gas, water cannons were used, and the official buildings, the Galley, the Prime Minister's residence, the Parliament, were rid of the protesters. There seems to be a little lull. Is it a lull before the storm, or has he broken the back of the protests? Can he think that he is safe and back home? But he has himself admitted that it would take more than a year before even a semblance of normalcy can return. For this is much too long a period in politics. He has to face an election, and in this, schools have reopened, but there is still a great paucity of life-saving drugs in hospitals. There is no fuel. There are large power cuts. There have been loss of jobs, and of course, tourism has been wrecked totally. Now, if this happens with a strict draconian emergency-like control of the people, it is again a simmering volcano. You can't really turn back the hands of the clock in Sri Lanka the way it has happened. The curiosity doesn't end here. The spokesperson Gunawardene of the new government came out with a very strange statement recently that the President Rajapaksa is not hiding. President Rajapaksa had not fled the country in the midnight. He is going to come back and be with his people. Now, there also has been a demand that Rajapaksa should not be granted asylum anywhere, especially in Singapore. He should be brought back and taken to court to be face responsibility for his treason to the constitution, his mismanagement of the economy. He wanted a safe passage. It is difficult. because it is difficult to imagine, to believe what the spokesperson, Mr. Gunawardene, says about Rajapakse, because the international media covered how he was fleeing in the middle of the night, how he was denied the VIP access to a plane, how an Air Force plane had taken him first to Maldives, then to Saudi Arabia, then from there to Singapore, and the Singapore government had taken trouble to make it very clear he had neither asked for asylum nor had he been granted an asylum. People on his behalf had said he wanted to get a guarantee that he would be not harmed, and then he would return or not return, or what would happen. His resignation was received under dramatic circumstances. So to say that Rajapakse Gota had not fled in the middle of the night and he would come back, there is no time frame. So these things erode the credibility of the present government quite considerably. But that is between Sri Lankan people and their government. The government of India has made it very clear that it stands by the people of Sri Lanka, regardless of caste, creed, religion. No Tamils, no Sinhalas, no Christians, no Muslims, no Buddhists. The government of India would do its best, whatever it can, to help Sri Lanka get back on its feet. The present government has also approached China to say that kindly reschedule the dates, kindly bail us out again. China has shown great reluctance to do so. So the problems of Sri Lanka under the present regime, the civil government seems to be stable, in control at the moment, but how long can it remain to do so is open to question. There has been another scare which has hit the headlines recently, and that is the outbreak of the pandemic of monkeypox. Now, it is difficult to say that whether it is a pandemic at the moment or not, because the WHO has shown great reluctance to even declare it as an international health emergency. This reminds us of the days of the outbreak of COVID, when the politics of COVID in international relations became a major issue. The WHO, which is an international organization under the auspices of the United Nations, seemed to be working under the thumb of the People's Republic of China, although it is funded mostly by the Americans. The American President Trump threatened at that stage, ex-President Trump, that if the WHO does not behave, it would stop funding of WHO and it would be wrecked totally. But the Chinese seem to be having extremely interesting, intriguing influence in WHO, and the WHO took too much time to declare an international health emergency and allowed the WHO virus to spread disastrously, which in the ultimate analysis, 250 million of people were infected, billions of people died, and WHO was found very much wanting. Then when WHO was given the task of finding out how the COVID virus had escaped from a lab in Wuhan, there again, its conduct left much to be desired. It dragged its feet too much. Not only that, when the vaccines were being created and marketed, WHO was insisting that it should certify whether emergency use certification should be granted or not. And this created all kinds of confusion. Certain countries did not wait for that, like China or the Soviets, they did not wait for the WHO certification. The other countries in India followed the parallel route. They had a native vaccine developed which could not be put in the market because the WHO was not willing to certify it. The fault was not only WHO's. The Indians had also taken a short route to this vaccine manufacture, which did not follow the protocol. But that was a situation, life and death situation then, when WHO seems to be very sadly wanting in either protocols or structure. So there was a demand about this. This seems to be repeated. This is not the first time WHO has done that. WHO has done a creditable work in eliminating endemic diseases like smallpox, polio, done reasonable progress towards malaria, cholera, etc. But the fact remains, when it comes to a pandemic, whether it is SARS, whether it is bird flu, whether it is AIDS, whether it is Ebola, it has faltered. It has faltered. This seems to be happening in the case of monkeypox. Now, in India, 4th case of monkeypox has only been discovered. But in the day of globalization, in the days of jet travel, you don't know how fast the vector travels and how fast, even more dangerous, the vector mutates, the virus mutates and multiplies itself. So right now we are having the problem of COVID becoming from a pandemic to an endemic, But the mankind is being told to learn to live with COVID. You can't have a lockdown. You can't have a zero lockdown like Shanghai, China, Hong Kong. Even Chinese are realizing that they have to open up slowly. And once you open up, you have to worry about another mutant of the virus. What we would like to remind our listeners is that it is not only the vaccine which is important. After the disease changes from a pandemic to an endemic, then there is a problem of a cure. Then the multinational companies produce drugs, which are life-saving drugs as for treatment of the disease. You can live your whole natural lifespan if you get the drugs. But the drugs are so expensive that the question of equity comes. So if a United Nations sponsored organization cannot either do its job fairly and efficiently to either trace the outbreak of a disease, warn the world about the outbreak of a disease, or to ensure equity in drug manufacture, I think it is failing very miserably, and the time has come to question structural reforms in this organization. To get back to monkeypox, the same kind of a scare is being done, both in terms of COVID. Is it an international health emergency or not? What is the mode of transmission? Like it was said that in AIDS, it is a same-sex relationship which causes this. But is it stigmatizing a segment of the population? Or it is stigmatizing a segment of the population on grounds of race? Chinese eat all kinds of animals. That's why there was a jump from a virus from one species to another in the case of COVID. Or blame something to the Africans for their ignorance and their reluctance to vaccinate themselves. There are major issues here which impinge directly on international relations. There are international tennis players who refuse to get themselves vaccinated because they are conscientious objectors. And they carry the risk. How many times can they have these special category individuals live in a bubble and go around the world playing life as usual in their games and so on? So we have to worry about a mechanism which is reliable, which tells the world about a health emergency, international health emergency, outbreak of a pandemic, what measures should be taken. There should be no double standards, no bending against the influence of a powerful actor, and also prepare for such contingencies in a multilateral forum where they can be efficiently done. Like climate, the pandemics are a common threat to mankind. This is all we have for you this time, but it's been quite a cupful or a glassful, if you like. We have interesting situations where we say that what is happening in different parts of the world. We see proximity between Indonesia and China preparing ground for a change of balance of power, not only in Indian Ocean region, but maybe elsewhere as well. We also talk in terms of power play in Africa between major powers. We have covered the gathering of developing nations in Bangladesh, which are not quite strictly speaking developing nations, but Muslim developing nations and at different stages of development. And do they affect our ties with our next door neighbors in South Asia? Or is it just another forum which people like to reassure themselves when they are trying to leverage their diplomatic negotiations with a neighbor somewhere else? There's a little give and take there. We witness the effort of the government in Sri Lanka to turn the hands of the clock back, but we don't know what will happen. And we obviously see statements made by these people which are not very credible. We also think in terms, we had a look at power play in African continent, which is interesting. The Americans are interested, the Russians are interested, the French are interested, and Indians cannot remain indifferent, although they are not quite in the same league. So if you keep all this in mind and then come to the outbreak of maybe yet another devastating pandemic, nobody at one stage had thought that COVID would be as devastating. The US president had said it is a kung fu flu, and Bolsonaro thought it was a bad flu, and both of them got COVID and survived. But unfortunately, millions did not. They died. So it was much worse than a common cold. So similarly, one doesn't know how a particular virus will mutate. So monkeypox, which has just occurred, few patients in India, one needs to keep one's fingers crossed and watch carefully. Think about all these things till we meet again next time. Thank you and goodbye.